Hi, Grandma here reading Crispin, The Cross of Lead, beginning with chapter 37. Crispin and Bear have made it to Great Wexly, and they are staying at the Green Man Tavern, or Green Man Inn. Bear has asked that Crispin stay in his room, but Crispin, like many teenagers, is eager to get out and explore. So that's how we're beginning chapter 37. It was mid-afternoon, shortly after the bells had rung for none. Now, none is the time it's mid-afternoon. They weren't so precise on their time telling back then as we are. When I stepped away from the back door of the Green Man, running, I regained the main street and once there began to look upon the town at my ease. As I went about, the hurly-burly world of countless people, buildings, and wares struck me with even greater force. If anything, Great Wexly seemed more tumultuous with more people, more happening than even before. But I was feeling bold and quite sure of myself. I don't need Bear to see the world, thought I. As I stood upon the street, enjoying the buffeting of those who passed, not sure which way I wished to go, a crowd of children rushed by, yowling and laughing. Curious to know where they would go and what they would do, I ran after them. The young people turned this way and that, and then, just as they appeared, they vanished. I had not the slightest idea where they had gone. Though baffled, I was not a bit disconcerted. With so much to see, I was content to ramble on, pausing to look at whatever took my interest, of which there was no scarcity. As for my penny, I purchased some white bread from a street vendor. It was light and sweet, and took little chewing to get down, which I found passing strange. After a while, I found the courage to leave the main stone-paved street and began to wander among backways. These proved to be dirt and mud lanes. Though very narrow, they cast an even greater stench than the main thoroughfare. These ways twisted and turned in every conceivable direction, with no logic that I could grasp. Yet I found myself excited not to know where I was going. How marvelously odd, I thought, to be required to pick and choose which way to go. What did I care that I had to make so many choices? It gave my head a pleasing whirl. And still more people, of many kinds. Some I could see, from the way they dressed, were poor. Yet even so they appeared to mingle with others of far greater wealth, and no one took offense. In time I found myself upon the main stone street again. It was there I saw a woman riding side straddle, a great black palfrey whose saddle and harness were trimmed with gleaming silver. Though the lady wore a black cape, I could see her gown. It was a brilliant blue, trimmed with golden fur. Her hair was tucked behind a squared-off, ruffled, netted cap of black lace. Her feet were shod in golden shoes with pointy tips. Her small hands were encrusted with sparkling jewels. As for her face of elder years, it was pale and haughty, and did not, or so it seemed, take in the world about her. Yet as she went by, she pressed a silken cloth to her nose, as if to block the offending street stench. Her nose knew where she was. Before her marched a boy, dressed entirely in black, a short gold and blue cape draped over one shoulder. He carried a long horn of bright metal from which dangled a flag of blue and gold. With every few steps he took, he lifted the horn to his lips and blared out notes to announce the lady's passing. Clustered around this lady were 6 men, wearing tunics with padded chests, their puffed sleeves lengthened to cover half their hands. One man led the lady's horse. Others marched on either side of her, while 3 more came behind. By the swords they carried, it was clear they were her guards. Though not so sumptuously dressed as she, they were splendid enough to look upon in their blue and gold livery. On each sleeve was a band of black. Who do you think this woman is? She must be very important to have somebody leading with a horn blowing to announce her way, and to have so many people attending her. One clue that we have is the band of black. A band of black worn on your arm is a sign of mourning. Somebody has died. Do you know of anybody in this book that has died recently besides the priest that could be related to this lady? Well, we'll see. For me, she was an amazing sight. I had never seen such astounding wealth, another marvel for my eyes. As she passed, people on the streets hastily made way for her, some doffing their hats or inclining their heads in reverence. Some even went down upon their knees, so I knew she had to be a person of great power. And yet, when the noble lady had once gone by, the crowds knitted together just as before, milling about, strolling, buying, selling. It was as if she'd never been there. Who was that? I asked a boy standing near me. He gave me a look of astonishment, as if I should have known. Why, it's Lady Furnival. I turned quickly to look after her, but she had gone. Chapter 38. All afternoon I wandered in a kind of daze, beguiled by what I saw. It was as if my world had multiplied many times in size, numbers, and wealth. My eyes fairly ached with marvels, seen even as my heart beat with sheer excitement. As for my anxiety about being in the town, it melted clear away. And then at that point in my wanderings, when I thought I'd seen all there was to see, I came upon the town's great square. Here, in a vast open space, greater than Stromford's entire commons, buildings pressed down on all sides. Some seemed new, some old, some were straight, others sagged. But the square was dominated by two buildings that stood at opposite sides. By far, the biggest structure was a great church, a cathedral, as I would learn, which soared upward with a multitude of towers. These towers, joined together by what looked like floating arches, were emblazoned with countless embellishments and statues that seemed as real as life. Set between the high front towers was a vast circle of stone and multicolored glass. Below it was the main entry, deep framed with columns and more statues. The whole gigantic structure seemed to rise toward heaven itself, stone leaping into glory. This is probably Gothic architecture, and that was exactly the point of Gothic architecture, that you felt like it reached to heaven. It was just so high. Opposite the church, on the other side of the square, was a large stone building, some 3 stories tall. Whereas the church rode high, this building seemed to cling to the earth with the weight and bulk that bespoke earthly power. On its first level were big wooden doors over which had been set an open space caged in with metal bars. To either side of these doors were small windows, similarly enclosed. But on the second level, at a considerable height, were 4 huge windows, side by side with pillars and stone tracery. Set before the windows was a balcony under which stone lions' heads protruded. Flags with various designs of blue and gold hung on poles. Other flags were black. Here, too, soldiers paced. That blue and gold must be the colors of Lord Furnival, probably in his family crest. And the flags that were black were probably, again, for his passing. The third level had smaller windows, but unlike the church which stood alone, this building was hemmed in close on either side by ordinary structures. Between the church and this large building was the great open space, the town square itself. It held crowds of traders with booths and stalls, with more sellers of goods and food than I could count. Swarms of buyers were in attendance. Most were walking, but a few were on horseback, wending their way through the middle of the crowds. I walked about the square, gazing at the endless numbers of things being sold, many of them objects I'd never beheld before. Cloth of many colors and types, Muscovy furs, that would be Russian, Toledo daggers, Spanish, Flemish hats, Belgium, Italian gloves. So they've got goods from all over Europe. There were baskets, boxes, and boots. There were shoes, tools, and armor. As for food and spices, why, I actually saw a bowl full of peppercorns. And everywhere coins clinked and abacuses rattled. I wish I had not already spent my penny. Timidly, I approached the great church itself. For a while, I stood before it, trying to decide if I might be allowed to enter. What, I wondered, might it be like to pray in such a place? But aside from its great size, it was the soldiers about the doors that made me hold back. Yet they seemed to be paying very little attention to the crowds of people who went in and out. When I saw children enter, I made the sign of cross over my heart and went forward. In truth, the soldiers barely looked at me as I passed through an entryway crowned by statues of Mary and Jesus, plus other saints whose names I did not know. I promised myself I'd return with Bear, who would, I was certain, know all of them. But when I stepped past the vestibule, I gasped. Before me was a space of such immense size, height, depth, and breadth that I never would have thought it could exist on mortal earth. Burning candles blossomed everywhere, enough to awe the stars. Through sweet and smoky air, great columns rose to dizzying heights, while enough multicolored glass light poured down through stained glass so as to turn the hard stone floor into pools of liquid hue. From somewhere unseen, a chorus of swelling chants rolled forth, filling this celestial space with sounds that made me think of the measured beating of angels' wings. It was as if I had entered paradise itself. Any number of people were milling about or were on their knees in prayer. Afraid to go any further, I sank to my knees too, pressed my hands together, and simply stared with wonder at the church itself, and then at the people. As I knelt, my gaze fastened on a particularly devout man who was kneeling, hands tightly clasped in prayer. Though he was wearing soldier's quilted canvas jacket, red leggings, and high leather boots, somehow he seemed familiar. After a while, he began to look about. As he turned, the hairs at the back of my neck began to prickle. In truth, I could hardly believe what I was seeing. It was none other than John Aycliffe, the steward of Stromfield Village. Moreover, I now realized he was not alone, but attended by men dressed in the same livery as that great lady I had seen had about her person. Even as I began to gasp who it was, Aycliffe shifted further about. Before I could gather my wits, he turned full face toward me. Our eyes seemed to fasten on one another. It was as if neither of us could believe the other was there. And we were in Stromford Forest once again. But then he set up a cry, shouting, "There!" and pointed right at me. "The boy! The Wolfset! He's here! Catch him!" These men, taken by surprise, spun around and saw whom he meant, then began running in my direction, shouting, knocking down anyone who stood in their way. By then I had collected wits enough to leap to my feet and race out of the church. Once outside, I plunged into the mass of people in the square, pushing and dodging to get away. After leaving the square, I raced on without any knowledge of where I was, running through one narrow lane after another. I went in no particular direction and never paused to look back. All I could think was that I had to get back to Bear. How long I ran, I don't know. but I was still pelting through a particularly narrow lane when a man leaped out in front of me. "Halt!" he cried, his arms spread wide enough to prevent me from passing. Chapter 39. Gulping for breath, I halted and spun about, only to find that another man had come up behind me. I flung myself against a wall, even as I struggled to get Bear's dagger out of my pocket. With the two men keeping to either side of me, I was unable to confront them both, but one I saw had a large stick in his hand, the other held a knife. "Keep away!" I screamed, finally managing to pull Bear's dagger free from its sheath. Though my heart was pounding and my legs were shaking, I held it before me as Bear had taught me. The dagger caused my attackers to hesitate. In that moment, I made a clumsy lunge at the man with the stick. Not only did he nimbly leap out of the way, he brought his stick down hard on my wrist. The pain and shock was so great I dropped the dagger. The next moment, arms locked around me from behind. I kicked and butted my head back. There was a sharp grunt, and the man's arms went slack, just enough to allow me to break his grasp. Head down, I charged straight at the man with the stick, catching him in the chest. He fell back. It was enough. With a burst, I ran past him down the alley. Then I plunged along a different narrow way, taking one turn after another, not daring even to glance back to see if I were being followed. I don't know how long I ran before I stopped and looked behind. Seeing no one, I allowed myself a moment's rest. Heart thudding to the point of pain, my wrist still smarting where it had been struck, I tried to grasp what had happened. Why Stromfield Stewart was in Great Wexly was something I could make no sense of. But what was clear was that, far from escaping pursuers who wished me dead, I'd come to a place where they could trap me. In my frantic state, I was quite sure that not even Bear could protect me. What's more, I had disobeyed him. It was not a thing I was sure he would forgive. And hadn't he told me to run away if attacked? I made up my mind to leave the town. I would get beyond the walls and flee. Exactly where I'd go didn't matter, as long as I escaped. While it was easy to make the decision, I quickly realized I had no idea where I was or where to go in order to leave. With my distress growing every moment, I looked around, trying to get some sense of my whereabouts. When I had first arrived in Great Wexly, I'd been overwhelmed by the multitude of different things I saw. Now, in a complete turnabout, my panic made everything seem the same. What's more, I couldn't help but feel that lurking behind every corner, every bend of each alley would be more of my enemies. Still, I also knew I couldn't remain where I was. My pursuers had already proved they knew the town well enough to track me down. Moving with great caution, I wandered down one alley after another, spying ahead even as I constantly checked behind. What made things worse was that no matter where I went, I had the sensation that I'd been there before. It was as if I could make no progress. But then I came to what seemed a good idea. Bear had told me that the Great Walls encircled the entire town. If that was the case, and I didn't doubt him, I supposed that I could find some part of them as long as I walked a straight line in any one direction. Then, once I found the walls, I'd follow around until I came to the gate through which we'd entered. From there, I'd make my exit from town and flee to safety. Feeling somewhat less apprehensive now that I had a plan, I immediately set off. Though I hurried, I remained alert, lest I blunder into another attack. Again and again, I made myself slow down. Try as I did to follow a straight line, I soon discovered it was impossible. The alleys and streets meandered in ways that bewildered me. It was as if I were in a maze. Even so, I forced myself to go on because I was afraid to stay in any one place. So I made my way by hugging walls, slipping around corners, all but crawling. Daylight was fading. The long summer twilight had begun to ebb. With it came a resumption of a chilly rain. Soon, misty dimness cloaked the air. The brightest light came from within houses, or the occasional passerby who made his way holding a flaming rush or lantern before him. Fewer and fewer people were abroad. Shadows lengthened. Now and again, men would stagger by, clearly having too much to drink. The only other noise, and it came from shuttered houses, was an occasional burst of laughter, an angry shout. A child called. At last I made out the town walls. They rose high over my head and seemed to melt into the murky sky. Nor were they smooth walls as I had imagined, but had houses built close against them. Even so, as far as I was concerned, I was making progress. Now, according to my plan, I needed only to follow the wall around. If I did, surely I would come upon the gate through which Bear and I had entered the town. Once again, my plan was faulty. The wall had not been built in a simple circle, but was in fact serpentine. Still, I continued on until I stumbled on a wide street paved with stone. When I recognized it as the one which Bear and I entered the town, I started to run along it. Then two things happened almost simultaneously. The town's church bells began to ring, and I saw what appeared to be a gate in the wall. Some 9 or 10 soldiers were milling about it. A few carried flares. Though I wasn't sure if it was the same gate by which Bear and I had entered, I told myself it didn't matter. It was a way out of town. I ran toward it. Even as I did, the great doors, hauled by soldiers, swung in and shut. Not believing what I was seeing, I stopped aghast and watched as the soldiers dropped huge beams across the doors to brace them shut. Then they added chains and even locks to keep the doors securely closed. Having shut the gates, most of the soldiers began to stroll away, leaving only 2 behind. I drew close enough for them to notice me. "Do you want to leave?" one of them called. "Yes, sir," I said. Too late. They're closed. They'll be open in the morning at prime. Now get yourself away. The curfew has begun. You should be behind doors." I remained standing where I was, unsure what to do. "Be off with you," a soldier shouted. I turned and began to wander. It had become night. The rain intensified. The streets, now swamps of muck and mud, were all but deserted, save for a few laggards. Even they moved hurriedly, no doubt wanting to get behind doors lest they be taken up and charged. Animals began to emerge, mostly pigs and dogs, but rats too. They were splashing about in search of things to eat. As night thickened, people put up their house shutters. The town grew even darker than before. Hearing the sound of marching, I turned quickly. Some 6 helmeted soldiers, armed with broadswords and bearing lanterns, were coming down the street. I leaped into a narrow alley and peered out. As they went by, the soldiers shouted out, "The hour of compline is at hand. The curfew is in force. No one may be out on the streets." As they passed, I shrank back, listening as they tramped and shouts grew fainter. It was night now. The town seemed asleep. The sky was black. The rain still fell. I wandered on, wet and miserable, looking for a place to conceal myself, hoping I might stumble upon the green man. The only sound I heard was the squish of my feet on the mud or stones. I hardly dared to breathe. Then I heard the sound of running feet. I pressed myself against the wall and peeked out around the corner. A group of men, torches held aloft, hurried past. By the light of their torches, I glimpsed their blue and gold livery. It was the same livery as Lady Furnival's entourage wore. But I recognized them as the steward's men. How could that be? Then I recalled something that I'd heard the stranger say in the forest. Aycliffe was Lady Furnival's kin. I wanted to think things through, but feared to take the time. Instead, I backed away and scurried down the narrowest of alleys, the walls so close I could have touched either side by stretching out both arms. I was halfway down it when I saw the hulking form of someone lurching toward me, hooded lantern in hand. I stopped, turned, and began to run in the opposite direction, only to hear a thunderous, "Crispin, stop!" And I'm going to stop too. Who do you think it is? Do you think it's Lord Furnival? No, he's dead. Do you think it was Aylward? Would he call him Crispin? Who would call him Crispin? Bear. Okay, see you later. Bye-bye.